Hello and welcome to Auspol Explained. I'm your curly-haired host, David. As you're probably aware by now, there is an upcoming referendum to change the Constitution. Naturally, changing the Constitution comes with a lot of questions, and people aren't necessarily super familiar with how the Constitution works and therefore might be pretty susceptible to misinformation. How do we know what's reliable or not? So, to get straight down to it, I decided to ask an actual constitutional expert about the Indigenous voice to Parliament. I sat down on Zoom with Professor Anne Toomey, a constitutional expert with our respective political bookcases behind us, and asked her all sorts of questions about the voice to Parliament. Now, it was a great conversation, but it was also pretty long, so I've split it into two parts. This is part one. The purpose and function. What is the voice to Parliament? Where did it come from, its history, and why would putting it in the Constitution have potentially a different impact than merely creating it through legislation? Part two will focus on the constitutional impact, on the legal system and Parliament, and all those sorts of questions to do with the High Court. So if you can't wait for part two to come out, I highly recommend you check out Constitutional Clarion on YouTube, which is hosted by Professor Anne Toomey, where she imparts her expert knowledge upon us with several video explainers. I highly recommend it, and the link is in the description. And with that in mind, let's dive right into my interview with a constitutional expert.
Hi, my name is Anne Toomey. I'm a former professor of constitutional law at the University of Sydney. They now call me a Professor Emerita, which means they don't pay me, but they still claim me. I was a member of the Constitutional Expert Group, advising the referendum working group on some of the constitutional and legal aspects about the voice. So from that point of view, I've had a semi-official role. I was also quite heavily involved in the instigation of the idea at the beginning.
Basically, what is the voice to Parliament?
The idea is to have some kind of a representative Indigenous body which can receive information from Indigenous people on the ground and to use that information to make representations to Parliament and the government in order to try and influence laws and policies either before they're made or after they're made to try and get them changed. So the constitutional provision, the proposed thing to put in the Constitution, gives it one function. And that function is to make representations to the Parliament and the executive government. And so what is a representation? Well, it's some kind of formal statement made on behalf of the people that are being represented. It could be a request that something be changed. It could be a complaint about the way things are working. People make representations to Parliament and the government all the time. So when you write to your MP or to a minister complaining about something, asking for something to be done, that's a representation that's made. So that's the role of the voice.
What is the purpose of the voice?
The point of it all, and this goes back historically a little bit, the reason the idea came up goes back to an earlier expert panel that reported to the Gillard government about how Indigenous people should be represented in the Constitution. It proposed a number of changes, including putting an anti-racial discrimination clause into the Constitution. The idea there being that, if there is a law and it was discriminatory, then Indigenous people could go to the courts and challenge that law and it could be struck down if it was invalid. Now, that was not supported by the government at the coalition side at the time, and the government itself didn't respond either. And so the voice came about by trying to flip the idea. So instead of having a system where you can come in at the end after the law or policy has been made and then attack it in a court, where all the action and the roles taken are by the lawyers and the judges and the legal proceedings, the idea of the voice was to just flip that over to the other side and say, well, instead of attacking things under a legal process after they've been done, which involves huge amount of time and resources and money and risk, because if you lose, you might have to pay costs, right? So all of those problems, let's flip it so that before policies and laws are made, Indigenous people have some kind of a say to try and get them shaped in a way to make them more effective and appropriate. Okay, and so that was the whole idea of the voice, taking it away from the whole litigation after the event and putting it into politics and influence before the event. And the other really important thing about this was the recognition part of it, which sometimes gets lost in the debate. So let me try and explain that. This was all about Indigenous recognition in the Constitution. The Constitution doesn't even refer to Australia's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples at the moment. And when you think about the idea of recognition, say, for example, you're in a town hall meeting or something or other, and the chair of the meeting recognises you. I recognise so-and-so. Well, what does that do? It gives you the right to then stand up and have your say. Okay, you're recognised by the chair, and we recognise people by giving them the respect of sitting and listening to them and taking what they say seriously. Doesn't mean you have to do what they tell you to do. It doesn't mean they have control or demand. It's about the respect of listening to their point of view. So the thing about the voice was that it fed into this idea that it gives Indigenous people agency. Instead of leaving it to the lawyers and the litigation at the end, it makes the Indigenous people the players, and it gives them recognition actively on an ongoing basis. So instead of just sticking in some words into a constitution that few people will ever look at, you've got this ongoing recognition because you're recognised every time that people stop to listen to you and give you the respect of that. And so the idea here was to have some kind of a representative body to represent the views of Indigenous people on the ground and to feed up from the ground that information so that the people who do make the decisions, who make the policy decisions and who make the decisions about laws, who with the best will in the world, they can be trying really hard to get good outcomes from Indigenous people. But if they don't live the life, if they're not on the ground and they don't know the details, right, of how these laws are going to affect people's lives, then they're not going to be able to craft the best laws. So the idea of the voice is to have a body which can have feeding up into it all the information from people on the ground in remote parts and all parts of the country, right? And use that body then to feed that information into Parliament and the executive, not to demand things, not to require things, but just so these people know when they make their laws and policies, well, here's an important issue and we need to shape this law in this particular way and it will give us a better outcome. It works on politics. It works on goodwill. It's not all about law and litigation. It's about having the ability to be heard and respected and then influence those decisions that are made so you end up with better laws and policies. You don't ever need to go to the litigation. That's what the whole game was about. It's been a bit distorted in the debate ever since, but that's what it was actually intended to do.
I mean, you said we can make representations, for example. Why would we put it in the Constitution if we're already able to make representations?
So you, I, and everybody else and organisations can and do make representations to Parliament. Probably you don't do it terribly often. I do it quite a bit because I make representations to parliamentary committees when they're holding inquiries, mostly because they ask me to, because I have a particular expertise in constitutional matters. So I will get many emails from parliamentary committees saying, can you please make a submission to us on blah? Okay, so I do that quite often. The problem is, though, as for, ordinary folk on the street who aren't being asked to make submissions to parliamentary committees, probably don't know the parliamentary committee's inquiring into something, don't know that the executive government's proposed to do something or other, because they don't have any kind of organisation representing them. So they've got two problems there. One is that their voice is weak because they're just one person, and why is anyone going to pay attention to them? And the other is they don't have the organisation to be able to know when to make representations or to get the right kind of evidence to make the right kind of representations to be effective. Okay, so how do you resolve that? Well, mostly it works by groups of people coming together, right, to have a bigger organisation to be able to manage those things. So A, you've got a bigger collective group, so people are going to pay more attention to you. And B, you've got the organisation to know when and how to make those representations and to have the best evidence to make your representations effective. So how do you do that? Working people got together, made trade unions, right? Business people get together and have business council. Miners get together and have the minerals council. Churches get together and have the National Council of Churches. Various ethnic groups get together and, you've got the Ethnic Council of New South Wales. So there's a whole lot of groups and organisations that do systematically make representations to government. There are also a whole lot of rich people as well and business people who hire lobbyists. So there are professional people who go around doing this. And we do know they have great influence, the people who hire lobbyists. Okay, so that's the basic thing about why is it you need a group, a body like The Voice to represent Indigenous people. On your own, one Indigenous person's not really going to be heard or have the capability to make these kinds of representations that will be influential, okay? An official organised body, which has some resources and the ability to reach out, to all these different communities, so you've got a structure to be able to do that, to get the evidence, etc. It's going to be much better and more effective at making representations. Right, so that gets us to level 1 of why you need a voice. But you say, okay, well, that voice could just be a legislative voice. And yes, you could do that. And yes, it would have some effect. It would be reasonably effective, one would imagine, at representing Indigenous people and being able to make useful and effective representations. So the next level is then, why stick it in the Constitution? What's the difference there? Okay, 2 reasons for that. First reason is to give it an ongoing existence and the capacity to work on an ongoing basis. So the idea of sticking it in the Constitution is to guarantee its existence. What's happened before is that there have been various Indigenous bodies that represented Indigenous people, and then when another government comes in and doesn't like them, they get abolished. All right, they disappear. So there's no longevity. There's no ability to build up expertise over time. There's no confidence in your funding over time that you're going to be able to do these things. It's a stop and start thing. And that's always been a problem with Indigenous policy. One lot will start this bit and another lot will say, nah, get rid of that. Let's do this. And it turns out into a big mess. So this is to add some kind of a level of permanency into the system. Second reason is to put the will of the Australian people behind it. Because if the Australian people in a referendum are telling politicians, we want these problems to be fixed. We want you to pay attention to make sure that we have the best possible laws for Indigenous people, and that involves listening to them. That gives a mandate and it puts political pressure on politicians to make the system work, because this is what we haven't had before. We haven't had the pressure being put on people. It makes it's a lot easier to just say, nah, there are problems here, let's just get rid of it, right? And that happens all the time. But if you have a permanent thing in the Constitution, what happens then? Politicians know, we're stuck with this thing. It's going to stay there. It's going to be a constant irritant. So what's the only rational thing to do in those circumstances? The only rational thing to do is make it effective and actually make it work so that we may end up with better policy. So you're putting pressure on politicians to make it work. The third reason is the idea of recognition, which goes back to what I said. This is about putting recognition into the Constitution of Indigenous people, not just by sticking words in it that no one is going to read. Let me rhetorically ask your listeners out there, how many of you know that Indigenous Australians are recognised in the Constitution of your state? And yes, I know it's every one of your states, because every single state constitution has recognition of Indigenous people in it. But you didn't know that, did you? You didn't know that, right? Because there was no referendum. It was just done by legislation. But the thing about the referendum is that when it puts it in the Constitution and everyone has to vote for it, A, they all know about it, okay? But B, what we're putting in there is not just words on the page like there are in the state constitutions, but we're putting in active recognition. So you recognise every single time you listen and pay attention and give respect to this organisation. So getting down to the short version of the answer, why do we need it in the Constitution? A, it's a genuine form of recognition. It's not just empty words. It's something that's there, that's doing something, and we recognise constantly and continually as Indigenous people are listened to and respected. Okay. B, it puts the pressure on politicians to actually make it work. And C, you've got that longevity to be able to ensure that it can work effectively over time.
From what I've read, right, one of the ways that it would make representations is in writing, like tabling. When people imagine that it's going to give advice, they're probably imagining that there would be an Indigenous person or multiple Indigenous people on the floor of Parliament giving a speech. Is that a likely thing? Or, you know, how are we likely to see, or do we know exactly how we would see them provide that advice?
It will be up to Parliament. So the third part of the amendment says it's up to Parliament to decide on things like the procedures. So procedures of how you make the advice would be a matter for Parliament to determine. So it's probably likely that the advice would be given formally in writing so that there's some kind of library of them, a stock that people can read so that they're accessible, rather than just having someone say something to someone, which is not something that's then kept. So if I were Parliament, I'd be saying that the advice should be, for example, tabled in Parliament. But there may be some cases where oral representations are made. But no, we wouldn't be having, for example, people standing up on the floor of the Parliament making speeches unless they're members of Parliament, because the floor of Parliament is only for members of Parliament. It would be a matter of the voice maybe making submissions to a parliamentary committee, or making giving a written document that's tabled in Parliament, or sending letters to ministers, that kind of thing.
Some people in my comment section are concerned that it'll, effectively filibuster and try and interfere with government business. But the way that you've somewhat summarised is very much that it is providing advice and it is not really able to chew up time, so to speak. Would it be possible to interfere with government business?
Well, it shouldn't be. Again, it's a matter for Parliament as to how it designs the processes for dealing with the voice. So it might say in some circumstances that yes, you do need to consult the voice in advance and you do need to give it reasonable time. And it might say in other circumstances, no, you don't. These are all things that Parliament should be able to decide under proposed section 129(3). And it would be up to Parliament to make sure that the system works in a sensible, reasonable way. So it's not designed so that Parliament or the government can't operate without the voice's advice. That's not how it's designed. But ultimately, it will be a matter for Parliament to decide what kind of procedures are going to be used for those interactions between the voice and the Parliament and the government.
How can we really make any sort of assumptions or assertions or any kind of solid idea of the voice if the legislation has not been written yet?
So the idea is that you need that flexibility. You'd be completely bonkers to put into the Constitution a thing that says it has, X number of members and they're chosen in this particular way, etc., because circumstances will change over time. And you may want to change it because it does become, dysfunctional or something or other. You might want to change the way it operates and how it's comprised, etc. And there's a whole chicken and egg thing going on here as well, because if you designed a version of it, right, and then people voted in a referendum, they'd say, well, we're voting on that version that you told us was going to be how it worked. And then you'd be in a pickle later on saying, oh, well, now we've decided, well, actually, we don't want it that way. We're going to change it. Or, we, the government, said we wanted to do X, but now we're going to change it because people in the Senate say they don't agree with doing X and we need to get the Senate's agreement to get the bill through. And people would say, hey, we've been cheated because we voted on it on the basis of this. So that's the predicament you're in if you're the government. If you set up some kind of system in advance and say, well, here are all the precise details of how it's going to be chosen, etc., you can't guarantee that that's what the Parliament's going to pass later on because you don't control both houses of Parliament. You can't guarantee that that's what the system's going to be like in 2 years or 3 years or 5 years. But the people voting in the referendum will think, hang on, we voted on that basis. So that's why it's sensible not to have those specific details in advance and say, well, it's going to be up to Parliament to decide. And it may well be that the Parliament, under this government, decides that the voice is going to be comprised in this particular way by this many people, and so this is how they're going to, whether they're going to be elected or appointed or whatever, and this is the structure we have. And it may well be that in, X amount of years, when the other side get into Parliament, they say, no, we want to do it in a different way. And that's perfectly legitimate, because that's what Parliament does. It's called democracy. And if you don't like it, if you don't like what the Parliament does in one of those laws, then guess what? You get to vote against it at the next election. Right? It's the part of the democratic system that we have. And it does slightly disturb me that people are so worried about Parliament deciding these things. And you think, well, hang on a minute, Parliament decides everything else. And if you don't want Parliament deciding these things, well, what do you want? Parliament, in the end, is the best system that we've got under a democratic system to decide these sorts of things.
A concern when it comes to sort of people's treatment of this, but also broadly many other issues, is not really understanding or having faith in the fact that we collectively as people hold the government and Parliament to account at elections and other means. So, in theory, if the voice is altered in a way that the public don't like, they have a say in this. It's not just like we're voting at a referendum to create an amorphous blob that we never have any further input on. It is definitely like, a thing that the public can, have an ongoing say in. Just really the fact that it's a constitutional amendment means that the government is limited in that it can't just simply get rid of it. It just has to carry on working with it within the confines of, its normal legislative processes and abilities and powers and responsibilities to the public. It just now has a dedicated, formal, ongoing, permanent Indigenous advisory body. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, look, ultimately, in the end, the Australian people do have a say. It's not just at elections as well. I mean, politicians have a pretty good radar, and they can tell when the people think that something that they're doing stinks. And then you'll find very quickly politicians and political parties getting very wary because they know they're going to lose their seat at the next election, and they don't want to do that because they'll lose money and all the rest of it. So they're pretty quick to turn around when they can see that what they're doing is highly unpopular. So, ultimately, the Australian people will have significant influence over how the voice is comprised and all those sorts of details, because if the people don't like it and they're prepared to turf the government on that basis, then the governments and political parties do tend to listen to that.
Thank you very much to Professor Anne Toomey for her time. I found that quite interesting and engaging. I hope you did too. That is the end of part 1, but subscribe for part 2, where we're going to go over things like, can the voice of Parliament have veto power? Spoilers, it can't. And what scope is there for potential litigation and court challenges? What kind of powers could the voice potentially have? I will link part 2 in the description when it comes out, but also there is going to be a bunch of links to reliable sources of information to help you learn more about the Indigenous voice to Parliament. So remember, it's up to all of us together to shape the Constitution and the future of Australia and vote. But we should be informed voters. Don't just trust any old thing you read on the internet. Part 2 is really going to debunk a lot of myths you've probably already heard by now. So share this, subscribe, check out Constitutional Clarion. Thank you to those who support me on Patreon, and comment down below what you would like to learn about next. Thank you so much, and I'll see you for part 2.